good morning, and good evening if you are in a different time zone. I'm Ziyu Chen, Director of the Asia Global Institute and Professor of Finance at the University of Hong Kong. Welcome to this special webinar on borderline disorder, historical ethnic borders and conflict in Africa. So today we are very happy to have Professor Ömer Özak from the Southern Methodist University in the great Dallas, Texas. So if you have not been to Texas, you can ask Professor Özak whatever questions you may have, including the ongoing elections and so on. So Professor Özak has done a lot of great, interesting work covering all different topics you can imagine related to geography, culture, and economic, as well as cultural development from a very, very long-term historical perspective. So the time frame his research has covered starts from at least 12,000 years ago, all the way to the present, including how to measure culture using Facebook data and stuff. So if you use Facebook, I guess you want to be really careful because you will be in their sample to be measured in interesting ways. So just a very quick note on the logistics for today's webinar. As before, we would like to reserve the questions for the Q&A time at the end. So what that means is for the next 1 hour, Professor Özak is going to give his presentation, followed by a discussion by Professor Tasfaye at the University of Hong Kong. And then after the discussion, then my colleague Chu Chenma will moderate the Q&A part by taking your questions from the Zoom chat room. All right, so without further ado, let me turn it to Professor Özak.
Thank you, Shiwu. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you everyone for coming to the presentation, joining us from, I imagine, many locations. Can you see my slides now?
Yeah, it's good.
Good, perfect. So let me kind of move this from here. Well, this is it's really a pleasure to be here. It's the first time actually I'm visiting East Asia, even though it's only virtually, but I think it's hopefully we will make it a reality at some point once travel resumes. So this is joint work with my longtime friend Emilio de Petris Chauvin, who is at PUC in Santiago de Chile. I am Ömer Özak. I am at the Department of Economics at SMU. And this is one paper which, I mean, we've been working on it quite a while. And it's kind of a follow-up from some of our previous work where we've been looking at how, in a sense, diversity and other forces affect economic development and conflict. And so if you look at the history of Africa, especially in the last 50 years, what you see is that conflict is one of the main problems that the continent is facing. First of all, conflict is very highly prevalent both across space and time. So it's a conflict that's happening in many places, and it has been happening for a long time in many of those places. It's been so prevalent, and really a lot of people think that conflict is part of the reasons that the region has been and has remained underdeveloped compared to other regions in the world. Of course, since this is such a central question about the development of Africa, there have been a lot of research has been done, and many explanations have been proposed, right? Coming from the availability of resources, climate shocks, population. There's been historical arguments about, for example, the results of the history of colonialism, etc., right? And interestingly, a lot of the literature, what it's done is mainly focused on a very broad definition of conflict, which has mainly been what's known as civil conflict in the literature, which means that at least one of the two parts in the conflict tends to be the state, right? And so the literature, by focusing on this type of civil conflict, in a sense, has overlooked most of the conflict that's small scale and what we call non-civil conflict, right? And interestingly, non-civil conflict is quite prevalent across both space and time. So if you look at the data that we have available, let's say from the 1990s onwards, about 44% of conflict events are of this small, local, non-civil nature, right? Also, if you look at the pairs of participants in a conflict, about half of them, close to half of them, actually are participating in this non-civil conflict, suggesting that somehow the literature has kind of paid less attention to a very important type and very prevalent type of conflict. Right? Now, if you look at the literature, what you find is that there's a large consensus in basically three things. First, that ethnic tensions are really a main catalyst of intrastate conflicts, right? So the differences between different ethnicities seem to be a major driver of intrastate conflicts in Africa. At the same time, the literature has written, and there are really literally thousands of papers on the role of national borders on conflict, right? And if you look at the literature, what you see is that there are basically two types of sub-literatures here. One is basically focusing on the effect of national borders on interstate conflict, right? And the reason national borders, in a sense, cause different states to fight each other. And part of the reason that this literature argues that national borders matter for interstate conflict is that borders allow states to have this opportunity for interaction with their neighbors. And of course, it also may affect their willingness to fight, especially for resources that are at the border, right? On the other hand, there's another strand of the literature that's been looking at the role of national borders in intrastate conflict. And here, it's mostly linked to, in a sense, the history of colonialism and the role of the scramble for Africa, where in a sense, national borders are basically splitting, dismembering different ethnicities, leaving part of the ethnicity in one country, another part in the other. And this is basically caused what's known as dismemberment and suffocation of ethnicities, which are also drivers of intrastate conflict. Right? And then there's a new or like more recent literature that's been kind of highlighting the role of history in modern conflict, right? Of course, there's a long tradition of explaining contemporary conflict based on, for example, the legacy of colonialism. But recently, there's a lot of work that's been done, that's been highlighting, for example, the differences across ethnicities due to pre-industrial, pre-colonial institutions or other cultural characteristics that may affect the willingness or the amount of conflict that different ethnicities have in their territory. Interestingly, historical ethnic borders have been basically ignored so far in the literature, right? And as I said, there are thousands of papers on these topics. And we think this is a very interesting omission, especially because every mechanism that you can think that may allow national borders to have a role in conflict, especially interstate conflict, is a similar mechanism that you can expect to be prevalent in intrastate conflict between ethnicities, right? And so if you ask, for example, Africans why they think groups within their country are fighting, what you find is that, for example, in the Afrobarometer for the 2000 year, into the year 2003, about 42% of respondents, which was the majority of the respondents, suggested that it's disputes about boundary and land that are the reason why there is conflict between groups in their country, right? And so it seems like there's this big omission in terms of, first, the type of conflict that has been studied, but also the role of ethnic borders, in historical ethnic borders in the literature, right? And so what are the fundamental questions that we want to answer in this paper? First, we want to try to understand whether the presence of historical ethnic borders affects the prevalence and intensity of conflict in Africa, right? That's basically, in a sense, our main objective. And if we find that historical ethnic borders seem to matter for location of conflict, we would like to try to understand why it is that they matter, right? And we want to try to understand whether characteristics of historical ethnic borders matter. So in a sense, if something about the geography of the border or some other characteristic which makes it perhaps more observable or more immutable may have a role to play in when a historical border has an impact on conflict. We'll also try to understand what type of conflicts tend to happen more at borders, right? At historical ethnic borders, right? Similarly, we'll try to understand what is the role of population pressure. And if you think about how Africa has changed in the last 200 years, how much this change in population may play a role in explaining the role of historical ethnic borders on a conflict. And finally, we try to understand whether diversity across borders, in a sense that differences, the cultural differences across borders matter or not for conflict. So what are our main hypotheses in a sense in which we are going to be building up our work? And the first is that historical ethnic homelands are really central to group identity, right? In a sense, if you look at, for example, some of the poems that you find in certain ethnicities or songs, there's a lot of attachment to their historical ethnic homeland, right? And usually it kind of highlights this ancestral ownership of the land, right? There's a very strong link between the ethnicity and the land that ethnicity has occupied, right? Now, if you look at the history of Africa, historically land was very abundant while population was really scarce, right? And so this meant that, let's say 200 years ago, there were or even more further behind in history, there were very low incentives for the control of land, right? And really what mattered was the control of population. Land was so abundant that people didn't have too much interest in really controlling very closely and strongly the land. And this is basically conducive to the emergence of very soft borders, right? Now, if you look at what has happened in the last 2 centuries, and especially in the last 50 years, the roles and then the abundance of land and people have basically switched, right? And so Africa has basically had a very late demographic transition, which has allowed population to grow very rapidly, right? So if you look at the data, in 1800, we had about 74 million Africans, and right now we have close to 1.3 billion Africans in the continent, right? So this is a really huge, impressive explosion in the population, right? At the same time, Africa is really characterized by low urbanization rates and a lot of rural to rural migration. And we will try to show you some evidence that this may play a very important role in the emergence of conflict, right? And of course, this may mean that in particular, competition for resources, of those resources, especially land that's agriculturally productive, may become stronger, right? And so as population is increasing and marginal lands are becoming scarcer and scarcer, of course, this will basically increase the value of those marginal lands, and we can expect really conflict to emerge where you have a lot of increases in population and very good land, especially we think if you have soft borders that don't allow allocation of property rights to be well assigned, right? And in particular, this should be the case in the case of historical ethnic borders because they tend to be more de facto than de jure, right? That is, they tend to be softer, just as I said, because historically there was less incentive for control. And so they tend to be very fussy, very vaguely delineated. There's no really strong demarcation of those borders. And so they are really very porous, right? That means that it's easy to cross those borders, right? And we think this is really conducive to the emergence of conflict because they create very weak ethnic and personal property rights in the sense that ethnicities may have overlapping claims on the land and on the institutions that control the land. There may be a weak personal property rights in the sense that you may not be able to really control the land that you're supposedly on, right? Similarly, they should be very conducive to overlapping claims on resources precisely because of these weak property rights. And by being so porous, they should allow interethnic contact and encroachment, right? And there's a lot of evidence in the news that you can find about this type of interaction, right? So what it is that we do in this paper? We basically going to explore the relation between historical ethnic borders and conflict, right? Our main focus will be on non-civil, local, and communal conflict, right? We provide in the model, in the paper, a model of ethnic border location. And this is mostly because we want to be able to use this model in our empirical analysis. And so we try to construct a very simplified model of conflict and that allows us to determine the location of borders and how much land is controlled by different ethnicities. Here in this presentation, I'm not going to go into this. I'm going to be focusing mostly on the empirical part, but I will mention a couple of the results that we have there. Now, once we go into the empirics, what we try to do is basically exploit georeference conflict data at a very fine local level, right? And exploit the spatial distribution of historical ethnic borders that has been provided by an ethnographer called Murdoch in the 1960s, right? We use artificial geographical units, basically cells of size 50 kilometers by 50 kilometers, and those are going to be our unit of analysis when we're doing all our empirics, right? And this will basically allow us to within country and within ethnicity analysis, right? And so let me show you a little bit in a simple map, kind of what the unit of analysis is, what the data would be, and what's the type of pattern that we're trying to look at, right? And so here we have a zoom on one part of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and in green, and I hope that this is visible in the zoom, you see the green squares are basically our unit of analysis. Each one of these is going to be a cell of 50 kilometers by 50 kilometers. Additionally, we have here in blue lines the historical ethnic borders, and of course we are giving in black letters the name of the ethnic homeland that belongs to this region. Additionally, we have in black lines the national borders, and in red dots we have, for example, in this case, we're just showing conflict about land, right? And what we want to try to do is basically use this unit of analysis, allocate to it whether there is conflict occurring in that cell, whether there's a border there, how long those borders are, the presence of national borders, of all kinds of geographical controls, etc. Right? And so our unit of analysis will always be this cell of 50 kilometers by 50 kilometers. Now, as I said, by using these artificial geographical units, we will be able to do within country, within ethnicity analysis, which will be very important for our identification. And then we use our model and the predictions of the model to allow us to construct an instrumental variable strategy that will try to help us potentially overcome some of the concerns that we have with the empirical analysis, right? In particular, we will see that the problem of mismeasurement will be very important, but also, of course, other problems as like reverse causality and omitted variable bias, etc. Right? And then we will go and try to study causes of conflict and try to see what types of conflicts are really happening in the different locations where we have borders. And additionally, we will try to look at heterogeneities at historical borders to try to understand what kind of characteristics of the border may matter for conflict. Okay. What do we find in case you have to leave early? First, we find a very robust relation between the presence of historical ethnic borders and conflict, right? And so what we find is that when a cell has a historical ethnic border, the intensive and extensive margins of conflict increase, right? And this is a particularly large impact when we look at local and ethnic conflicts, which are in a sense closer to the type of conflicts we think should matter for or for which historical ethnic border should matter, right? We find that this are also especially big and important in conflicts over land and border demarcation. And interestingly, we do not find any impact on religious conflict, right? So in a sense, historical ethnic borders don't seem to matter for some of these religious conflicts that we are observing in the continent. Now, when we look at what kind of characteristics of a border matter, what we find is that first, their strategic value is really important, right? Especially borders at which you have very high land quality for agriculture, you tend to find more conflict. Similarly, we find that borders that basically are congruent with more harder defined borders, like administrative borders, we tend to see a decrease in conflict. Similarly, we find that similarity across the border in cultural terms, especially in terms of the economic subsistence of the two ethnicities on both sides of the border, increases conflict. That means that the more similar those ethnicities are across the border, the more conflict we will observe, right? And additionally, we find that borders which have experienced a lot of population increase in the last 50 years tend to be the ones where we observe a lot of conflict, right? And finally, we will provide you some evidence that land ownership is in a sense less general when we are close to the border, right? And especially locations where you have a lot of migrants, or especially if you look at migrants that have migrated from the rural area into the rural area within their own ethnic group, they tend to have a lower probability of actually owning the land that they work in, right? In a sense, again, complementary evidence that somehow a lot of the conflict may be related to land tenure. Good. Now, since I will jump straight to the empirical part of the paper, let me tell you a little bit more about our empirical approach, right? So our analysis basically, as I said, will be on exploiting cell level data where we have cells of 50 kilometers by 50 kilometers, which will allow us to have a sample of over 14,000 cells for all of Africa, right? And we will combine data coming from various sources. First, we will get our conflict data from both the two main providers of conflict data for the world, right? The first is ACLED and the second is the UCDB PRIO. Both of these sources are really high quality, have been used widely in the literature, and the advantage that they really provide us with the geocoded location of the conflict. So we know exactly the latitude or quite precisely the latitude and longitude where the conflict is taking place. Second, we will use data on historical ethnic borders, which is one of the so-called Murdoch map, which has been previously used in many papers. We will also take identifications for the ethnicity that's located in a certain location based on this Murdoch map. We will additionally add some cultural and linguistic characteristics to each cell by exploiting data from the ethnographic atlas and the ethnologue, which will allow us to see, for example, characteristics like what's your economic subsistence strategy, if you mostly are a herder or you actually do agriculture, the number of languages that are spoken in the location, etc. Additionally, for each cell, we will compute a large set of geographical and climatic covariates, trying to capture like topography, land suitability, environment for diseases, whether there's a presence of water, cities, etc. And of course, since we will try to ensure that we're not capturing other more usual sources of conflict, we will also try to control for those. And in particular, it's important that we will be controlling for the presence of resources like diamonds, oil, and minerals. And we will also be looking at the presence of national and other administrative borders within the country. So if we look at the data on historical ethnic borders in Africa, basically what we're going to do is use the source that's been most used widely in the literature, right? And so this is basically the so-called Murdoch map. And Murdoch, so in 1959, basically created a map by putting together all the information he could based on ethnographies of Africa to try to identify the ethnic homelands of all the ethnicities that were available. And so in 2008, Nathan Nunn digitized this map, and we're going to be basically using his digitized version. And this map has been previously used as an exogenous variation to basically run analysis where you exploit regression discontinuity, and you look at, for example, characteristics on both sides of the border to try to see whether those characteristics mattered for conflict, right? And so it's not like we're the first to actually use this map, but we're the first that actually are trying to look at the presence of these borders to actually affect conflict, right? And so here we have the location of all the homelands and borders that we have in Africa according to this Murdoch map. Good. Next, we basically, what we want to do is compare locations where we have cells which have and with cells that don't have conflict, right? And here in this graph, I'm basically showing you the probability of conflict without any controls when I compare cells that have a border to cells that don't have a border. And we see that basically the average probability of those cells that have a border is almost twice as high as the probability of conflict in locations that don't have a border, right? And in a sense, all the part of the paper is going to try to convince you that this correlation that I'm showing you here is actually present in the data and it's not capturing some other things, right? And so, of course, there are lots of challenges to identification in this problem, right? First, of course, all these borders are not randomly assigned, right? Of course, we wish that was the case, but that's not really the case, right? Also, we do know that there should be non-trivial measurement error in Murdoch's map, right? And even, I think this is not only a problem of the data sources themselves. Let's say it's not that Murdoch did a poor job in this. We would almost say that by their own nature, precisely as we said, since historical ethnic borders are porous and really soft, we don't expect them to be well defined. And of course, that means that even no matter how technologically advanced you would have been, you would not be able to really pin them down correctly, right? And so we really do have some non-trivial measurement error in this map. So how are we going to try to address these two main issues? So first, of course, we want to try to account for all potential observables that we can. And so we include a lot of geographical and climatic controls in our analysis. And of course, we also try to control for other sources of conflict that may be confounding this correlation that we're showing, right? Second, we're going to exploit within ethnicity and within country variation. That is, we're going to account for both country and ethnicity fixed effects. And we're only going to be comparing cells that are located within the same ethnic homeland of the same ethnicity in the same country, right? And this is very important because it allows us to overcome problems where clearly the associations that we're going to be finding cannot be driven by historical characteristics like the identity of the colonial power that ruled that country. It won't be driven by the type of legal origins it has or a kind of national institutions. At the same time, it will not be reflecting any kind of ethnic characteristics, right? Let's say it's not that one ethnicity likes to fight more than another or anything like this, right? So all kinds of ethnic specific and country specific and variant characteristics we're going to basically try to control with these two set of fixed effects. Then we're going to try to provide you some evidence using placebo analysis that indeed there is something special about this relationship between historical ethnic borders and conflict, right? Additionally, in order to try to address this measurement error problem, we will vary cell sizes, right? And so we're not only going to show results at the 50 by 50, but at the 10 by 10, at the 100 by 100, right? And of course, the type of measurement error and the size of the measurement error should change depending on the cell size. And we hope that by looking at different cell sizes, we can, if finding the same type of results, should kind of help us get more convinced in a sense that there is something really fundamental that's happening here. Right? And then finally, we're going to exploit some instrumental variable strategy based on the model of border location that we have in the paper, right? And basically what this will allow us to do is generate a prediction where we should see a border originally. So we will construct a potential border and we use this potential border to instrument our actual historical border, right? And so in a sense, if you come from the measurement error literature, you could think of our IV as kind of a second mismeasured measure of historical ethnic borders. The only difference is that unlike Murdoch's map, which could be that he draw the different borders based on certain geographical characteristics, we will try to convince you that our instrument really is orthogonal to any characteristic of the cell where this potential border is. And so in a sense, it will basically allow us to address measurement error, but also hopefully we think we can make the case it buys us a little bit extra in terms of identification. So let me start by showing you the association between conflict and the presence of historical ethnic borders by using OLS. And so here we have in the first 5 columns, basically, and the extensive margin of borders and its related association with the extensive margin of conflict, right? Whether there's a presence of conflict in locations where we have a historical ethnic border, right? And within column 1, we have no controls, and we see that the presence of an ethnic border basically increases by close to 14%, 13 percentage points, the probability of observing a conflict in this location, this cell. In this column 2, we add country fixed effects. Column 3, we add ethnic fixed effect, and we see that indeed both country and ethnic fixed effect absorb a lot of this, the size of the coefficient. We still see a 7 percentage point increase in the probability of conflict when we have a border. And then we add both climatic and geographical controls in columns 4 and 5. And we see that the coefficient falls a little bit, but they are not too statistically different from the coefficient that we find in column 3, right? Suggesting that indeed, almost like if you control for country and ethnicity fixed effect, a lot of the variation will be, and omitted variables that may be affecting this relationship may be captured there already. And then in column 6, 7, and 8, we're basically using a different type of measure instead of using extensive measures, we're using intensive measure. I see there's a question. Let me just, I didn't know in the end if I'm supposed to answer clarifying questions here. I will show you some the mean in a couple of slides. I didn't put them in this table, but I have a table where I have all the means, right? This is quite a significant effect, right? I think for this measure of conflict, I think the average is close to 20%, right? So it is about a quarter of the mean in this case. Good. Let me second show you a placebo analysis that in a sense will try to show you that there's something special about these ethnic borders, that it's not simply that perhaps you have too much conflict, too much borders. And of course, if you have too much of two things, then of course it can be that you randomly are finding a correlation. On the other hand, we also want to try to convince you that there's something special in a sense about this spatial pattern that borders are generating, right? So here what we do is basically randomization inference, where we are randomly reassigning the presence of an ethnic border across all the locations in Africa, maintaining both the distribution of borders to ensure that we are basically comparing apples to apples. And also we do this in basically 2 ways. In one case, we're just randomizing across the whole continent. In the other case, we're really randomizing only within country and keeping the country prevalence of borders also constant, right? And so the distribution within countries, the distribution within the continent. And then we basically run 10,000 times the same type of regression that we're doing here. And what we see here is that the distribution of the coefficients estimated in these regressions is very much close to 0 on average. And we see that our estimate is really far, far to the right, suggesting that there is indeed something special about these historical ethnic borders, right? It's really quite far away from basically even what we can observe here in terms of the tails. Okay, good. Now, of course, this is all, in a sense, has all the potential problems that we were talking about, but so we'll try to do is basically try to provide some improvement on this using our theory-based instrumental variable strategy. Right? And so what we want to do is construct a measure of potential historical borders based on what we find in our model of border location, right? And so there we basically are modeling the interaction between ethnicities and allocation in terms of conflict and how much invest in weaponry, etc. And what we show is that the equilibrium borders in that model basically creates what's known as a Voronoi partition of the land, right? That means that for every ethnicity, its homeland should be basically all locations that are very close to its center of gravity compared to that of any other, right? And so Voronoi have a lot of very nice properties. First of all, these are really based on centroids of a homeland, right? And so this tends to be, in a sense, global property of the ethnic homeland, right? So if you think about it, it's kind of a ethnic level characteristic. And so again, since we're really controlling for ethnicity fixed effect, is going to help us in terms of identification. But second, and perhaps more importantly, Voronoi borders are really a global property of the spatial distribution of all the centroids, right? So in a sense, again, even if you perturb something in one place of the continent, this should have very small effects on the location of borders everywhere else, right? And finally, the Voronoi borders are really independent of any cell level characteristics. They really depend only on the location of those centroids and really nothing else, right? And so this means that these are really independent of any kind of geographical conditions at the cell, right? Independent of any institutional, cultural, or ethnic characteristics, and should be independent of any kind of historical characteristics, right? So in a sense, as I said, this is really giving us kind of a second mismeasured measure of the location of borders, which if we didn't have any omitted variables, we would already be very confident that this gives us a good estimate of the causal effect. But of course, at the same time, since we know that there may be other things that may be happening, at least it seems that just because the way it's constructed is orthogonal to everything else that you may worry about, hopefully this should also help us with identification in a more general sense, right? And so what we suggest is that once you have country and ethnicity fixed effect, you should expect conditional independence of these potential borders, right? And so, of course, one really important aspect of all the strategy that we're following here is the location of that centroid, right? And so here we will be basically first starting with the geometric centroid of the homeland, right? But then we will show you that we can use other versions of the centroid and we get basically the same type of results, right? And so just to get a simplified idea of what's happening here, imagine that here in blue, you have the homeland of ethnicity A, in red, you have the homeland of ethnicity B, and you have this squiggled line that's the historical ethnic border, right? Once we find the location of the centroids, which in this case are given by XA and XB, what we will do is assign to each ethnicity the area that's closest to these two centroids, which will basically, in this case, split the continent. In this case, it's only this set of cells in these two homelands, right? And so it's really, and it doesn't matter really what kind of characteristics ethnicity A had, what kind of characteristics ethnicity B had. It doesn't matter any of the geographical characteristics of any of these cells that we have here, right? And so basically what we'll be doing is doing this at the level of Africa, right? So we take all the locations of all the homelands that, that we have in the Murdoch map. We will find their geometric centroid, right, in our main analysis. And then based on those centroids, we will construct the Voronoi partition that those centroids generate. And these are the borders that we will use as an instrument for our other borders, right? And so in a sense, if you just look at this very quickly like this, it suggests that there should be some correlation between this, right? And here we have this map for all of Africa. And of course, we will see some difference, but in a sense, in general, we do find a lot of similarity between these borders. Good. Let me show you first the first stage and the correlation between both measures of historical ethnic borders, right? Our presence of Voronoi border in our cell and see how well it predicts the presence of ethnic borders in the cell, right? And again, here we're basically following the same the empirical setup for those 5 columns, right? In column 1, we have no controls. We see that the presence of a Voronoi border basically increases the probability that you find, or the prediction that you find a historical ethnic border according to Murdoch by basically 33 percentage points. Once we add country and ethnicity fixed effects, These absorb a lot of the variation, but still we find a very strong positive correlation. And as we introduce additional geographical controls, climatic controls at the cell level, what we see is that basically the coefficient doesn't change, right? Kind of suggesting that what we were saying, that once you control for country and ethnicity fixed effect, really nothing else should affect this association between the presence of the Voronoi border and the presence of his Murdoch borders. Here I'm basically representing some of the results that I had shown you before, but using our instrumental variable strategy, right? And so here we have in columns 1 and 2, again, the extensive measure, columns 3 to 5, the intensive measure. And what we find is everywhere there is a really large impact on conflict or by the presence of historical borders, right? And here going back to the question that was raised before, what the average is, it's about 22% of the cells do have this type of conflict, right? And we see that our coefficient is close to 28%, right? So that means that it's increasing by more than the average, right? Now, of course, if this is, since we were talking about measurement error, this could be partly this huge increase, right? And we saw that basically this increase is 3-4-fold. A lot of it may be because of the measurement error, which in this case could be a non-classical. And so we don't want you to fully, if you don't want to fully buy that this is a causal estimate, what you can think of this is really the true causal estimate should be somewhere between the OLS and the IV strategy and the IV estimate in the presence of this non-classical measurement error, right? We see that, again, very large estimates when you look at intensity of conflict. And here we're adding 2 additional measures that look at whether a cell is the first location of a specific conflict, right? And so what we see is that indeed it increases more than twice the average probability of a cell being the initial location of conflict if there is a historical ethnic border, right? And of course, it also increases the number of times a conflict starts at those borders, right? Again, suggesting that there is something really particular to these borders, right? Now, of course, we could be concerned that this may be driven partly because of the fact that in the past you had conflict that just remains in the same location. And so you see borders and conflict in the same place. And here we're showing in the first 3 columns the correlation between the presence of historical ethnic borders and location and the presence of historical wars during the 19th century, right? And what we find is that there is really no association between this. It doesn't matter if we're looking at all types of wars that we saw observed, if it was only war among Africans or if it was between Africans and colonial powers, right? We don't see any kind of association there. Still, presence of historical conflicts do matter for contemporary conflicts, but they are really not correlated. They're not really affecting our estimates in this case, right? We show a lot of robustness results, but which I don't want to get too much into. I may leave it for the question afterwards, but we do robustness by changing the type of centroids we use. And so instead of using a geometric one, we use, for example, the location of most suitability and of highest suitability within the ethnic homeland. We use centroids coming from another data source. Instead of using geodesic distances to assign these historical borders, we use migratory distances. We do clustering at all kinds of things. We exclude countries that have very low population and low conflict, as well as high population and high conflict. We get the same results. We exclude split ethnicities, neighbors of split ethnicities. We get all the same kind of results. And as I said, we replicate this using different cell sizes, different types of data, and the results are basically the same, right? We can control for a lot of the other sources of conflict that have been suggested, right? Disease, climate, access to water sources, rivers, coasts, sources of other types of other sources of conflict, the level of diversity within each cell, and the distance to capital cities and the centroid itself. And we don't find that any of these affect our results, right? We replicate our placebo analysis by doing this time the instrument. Again, here we're randomizing both the instrument and the location of the historical border, trying to maintain the correlation between the instrument and the historical border. And we see again the same kind of picture. Random borders really don't seem to be correlated with conflict, but historical ethnic borders are really strongly associated. Right? Now, the next step we would like to convince you, or like, I mean, if you believe our story, and we would like to present some evidence that there are indeed mechanisms through which historical ethnic borders matter for conflict, right? And so we'll look at different types of conflict, especially focusing on local, ethnic, and territorial conflicts. We will look at the different types of border issues and how this heterogeneity may matter for those border issues. And then we're going to look at first, the effect of recent population pressure at the border, the competition for resources by ethnicities that are similar or different across the border. And then we will look a little bit into land tenure and migration, right? So first, let me show you how the association between the presence of ethnic borders and conflict varies depending on the type of conflict, right? And here again, I have shown you the average of each of these types of conflicts across all of Africa. And then we can compare this with the size of the coefficient that we have here on the effect of the presence of ethnic borders on different types of conflict. So in column 1, we have basically, again, our main measure, which is non-civil conflict. In column 2, see, I have another question. It seems it's the same question. Column 2, we're looking only at very localized types of conflict. That means that it doesn't include any kind of actors that are more national or anything like this. These are really local conflicts. And we see, again, a very large impact if we compare it to the mean. If we look at only ethnic level conflicts, we see that's basically twice the size of the mean. If we look at land conflicts, it's about 50% larger than the mean. If they look at territorial conflict, again, much larger. If we look at about authority, but especially if you look at border and territorial conflicts, we see that it's really a very large and statistically significant effect. And again, as I mentioned before, we don't seem to find any impact on religious conflicts. Next, we want to show you some evidence about the characteristics at the border that may matter for conflict, right? And in particular here, first, I want to look at geographical characteristics that may allow you to perhaps delineate borders better, right? And so we're basically controlling always for certain characteristic in the cell, but then we're kind of measuring within a very close band around the border, the difference in that characteristic to the cell, right? And so here we have, let's say, the elevation at the border. We see that, I mean, it's negative, but it's really not significant. Part of it could just be measurement error, but we don't want to make too big as an issue here, but it seems like there could be a negative association. If you look at ruggedness, you can imagine that very rugged terrain is very important for strategic reasons, maybe difficult to control. And so you may actually expect to have more conflict at borders that are very rugged or in very rugged terrain. And that's really what we find. We look at whether the presence of a river, which may, again, help us delineate better, like rivers don't tend to move overnight. But strangely, we don't find an effect there. Partly could be mismeasurement. It's not 100% clear, or it may just be that rivers are not as useful as we thought for delineating borders. Coasts, on the other hand, we find this marginally statistically significant negative association. So borders that tend to have coasts seem to help delineate better those ethnic homelands. And then we look at the presence of, or like the co-location of ecological borders and historical ethnic borders. And we could expect that, of course, as some have argued, that different ecological zones may give rise to different cultures. And so perhaps this presence of an ecological border may be conducive or non-conducive to conflict. Here, what we find, and we will provide some evidence that's kind of going in the same direction, is that it doesn't seem to be the case that the presence of an ecological border increases conflict. If at all, it seems to decrease, right? And finally, in columns 7 and 8, we look at what happens when, in a sense, this soft historical border has become a hard border by basically becoming an administrative border or by becoming a national border, right? That, in a sense, it suggests that this is, or the potential problems have been solved. And what we find is that indeed the presence of an administrative border or a national border decreases the presence of a conflict if the same border is also an ethnic border in a sense, right? This is really, this is not, it's really one border on top of the other, what we're trying to capture. Right? Then we try to look at whether the presence of resources at the border matter for conflict. And here we're looking at how suitable the land is around the border, whether there are diamonds, minerals, oil, and cities. And what we find is that especially suitability for agriculture and the presence of minerals has a huge impact in additional increasing conflict, right? And of course, the more suitable the land is at the border, the even higher the level of conflict that we will observe, right? Which kind of goes precisely with some of the narratives that have been provided in the literature, especially in political science, right? Next, if we look, and this is kind of complementary at the effect of increases in population since 1960, what we find is that borders that have had a larger increase in population also seem to have higher levels of conflict. And again, it doesn't seem to matter what kind of conflict really seems to, any border that's receiving a lot of people, although there's been a lot of population growth in the last 50 years, has basically had a large increase in conflict. Right? Next, let me show you, and basically I think I have like 5 minutes. Let me show you the last two pieces of evidence. One is looking at how similar the cultures are across the border. That is, if we have ethnicity A and B, and we try to measure in various ways how culturally similar these two ethnicities are. And when we look at, for example, column 2, what we're looking at is a measure of how similar their subsistence strategies are. That is, what percentages of their consumption or their livelihood is coming from hunting, gathering, growing crops, or actually herding or fishing, right? And we're looking at how similar the subsistence strategies are, right? And there's part of the literature that would have argued that the more dissimilar they are, we would expect to have more conflict. But we find, and this goes in line with some of the evidence that has been provided, for example, for the case of Europe, but also for some other theoretical models, where what we find is that the more similar you are, actually, the more conflict there is, right? And so here what we see is that the more different you are, or the larger the distance in the subsistence strategy, the less conflict you will observe at these borders, right? And we do this cultural measure in different ways. We use the subsistence strategy, which we have from the ethnographic atlas. The good thing there is that we really have the data for all the ethnicities. We use linguistic distances at different levels of aggregation. We get similar results. We use all the available or potentially available data that we have in the ethnographic atlas, and we get basically the same results, right? And we always seem to find that the more similar you are across the border, the more conflict you will have, or the more different you are, you actually see less conflict, suggesting that there is some complementarity and you have less competition for resources at the border when you are more culturally distant. Right? And finally, we're looking at land tenure across 33 countries for which we have data from the DHS, right? And so here we are looking in the first 4 columns for all the sample of all women that were interviewed in these, all the rounds of the DHS. In the second set of 4 columns, we're basically looking at only women that are self-identified and have self-identified their ethnicity, and we're going to be able to compare only women to other women from their own ethnicity. Right? And so if you look at basically the first 4 columns, what we find is that the further away you are from an ethnic border, the higher the probability there is that you actually own the land that you work, right? And so basically all these women tend to have a higher probability of owning the land they work in. And this is true for the only rural sample. Same thing for only the rural migrant sample. And moreover, it's actually true, and even perhaps a little bit larger, than for the rural sample, for those who are migrants who migrated from a rural area to another rural area, right? Again, suggesting that competition for resources may be an important reason and mechanism behind this. And when we do this by accounting, and of course here we are accounting for country, wave, ethnic homeland fixed effect, geographical controls, individual level controls, right? In the second set of columns, we also additionally account for your own ethnicity. So here we're comparing women who are located in some same ethnic homeland, and we're comparing them only to women from the same ethnicity, right? And so here what we find is, in a sense, first larger estimate, but also more statistically significant, right? And so if you focus in the last one, basically what we find is that increasing the distance to an historical ethnic border increases also the probability of a rural migrant to actually have land and that they own themselves. Right? So let me conclude, since I think my time is up. Basically what we do in this paper is present evidence on the role of historical ethnic borders and conflict in Africa, right? It's a very important topic, we think. It's really omitted in the literature. It's both omitted in terms of the source of conflict, but also in the types of conflicts that we're studying. We find a very robust pattern. It doesn't seem that anything else, any of the controls or anything is really making this a weaker pattern in the data. We find an effect that's quite large, right? Especially if you compare to the average prevalence in the continent. We find that characteristics of the border matter, right? Similarity across border increases conflict, suggesting again that this may be driven by competition for similar resources that you like. We find that the difference between fuzzy and hard borders seem to be very important in the sense that the fuzzier the border, the more conducive it will be to conflict. And finally, we find that borders where there's been a lot of increase in population in the last 50 years, there's more conflict also. And finally, we find that migrants own less land close to borders, again, suggesting that perhaps indeed this competition for resources is more intensive at the border. Thank you. So now I think we can open to questions.
Okay, so thank you very much, Professor Özak, for your wonderful talk.
Thank you.
So now we will turn to the session of discussion. Well, today our discussion is also interdisciplinary. We are very happy to invite Professor Faisal Tesfaye. He's our Hong Kong University colleague. He is now the Program Director of African Study in University of Hong Kong. Professor Tesfaye is an expert of African study and African history. He is a historian and also a political scientist. So now let's welcome Professor Tesfaye to discuss Professor Özak's paper and presentation. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Shisheng. Thank you very much, Professor Özak, for your very interesting and eye-opening presentation. I think you know, your approach is not a usual one, and therefore, what I'm going to do here is maybe make 3 points and try to bring in the historical perspective because I'm a historian. So the cautionary tale that I would like to start with is to say that these are comments made by a historian who has very little understanding, unfortunately, of numbers and models.
Did we lose him, or am I the only one not hearing you?
Hey, Faisal, we cannot hear you. So can you check the microphone?
I think we have lost him. Oh. Okay, good.
So Faisal, you can unmute now.
I'm sorry.
Okay, good.
Technical problems.
Yeah, good.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, good.
Okay, perfect. The first point I would like to comment on is the use of the terms ethnic identities, or the terms ethnic identities, ethnicity, and conflict. I think, you know, as you rightly mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, there is a wide definition. I mean, there's no agreement as such on how to define ethnicity and ethnic groups, right? Now, the definition that is currently and very much used when dealing with Africa is the Eurocentric definition, right? The Eurocentric definition, which, you know, at the very beginning, Africa was divided into many tribes, in quotation marks, and after the decolonization period, those tribes somehow transformed into ethnic groups. So it's a bit of a, you know, there is a certain continuity there. And what I think is that this, you know, instead of clarifying what an ethnic group or ethnicity is, we are still dealing with the heavy colonial past of these terms. And now the reason why I'm saying this is very simple. It is because you know, these items, these terms are unfortunately used to define and explain the state in which the continent finds itself today. So, for instance, that the continent is not developed enough, or the problems of conflicts that would appear, the easiest explanation that is given is to say that, you know, it's the ethnic groups that are fighting against each other, and we stop, as you rightly indicated, right? There are other factors that are leading to conflict, and those things are left out. So for Africa, the fact that there are different ethnic groups seems to be enough. Whereas if we took that somewhere else, it's not the ethnic group that we would see, but something else being the reason for the conflict. I'll come back to this again later. So other factors tend to be forgotten when taking ethnic identity and ethnicity as a common denominator, as it is the case, as it's being done in the African case. I can explain more later on if you will, but let me go to the second point. The second point is borders, right? The notion of borders in the African continent is one that is really complicated one. Complicated because it wasn't made by the Africans themselves, right? My country of origin, Ethiopia, its borders were defined by the various colonial powers that were fighting against the Ethiopian imperial power. So the borders themselves are the result of conflicts between various imperial powers, but this is the case of Ethiopia. But if you take the case of Rwanda, for instance, Rwanda was chopped, and not alone, actually. Rwanda, Burundi were chopped on the map, right? If you think of the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, you know, it's the colonial borders of the Congo as it was created, if you will, by King Leopold II, that has remained. Now, this issue of borders in Africa is something that the continent is still trying to grapple with, right? I'm thinking here, for instance, of the Border Commission of the African Union that today, even today, 50 odd years after the independences of most of these countries, is trying to solve whether or not colonial borders should or should not be maintained. Now, the way the borders are done today, you can, you have a village that is simply chopped into two countries, and your cousins end up belonging to state A, and you end up in state B. So these are very problematic kind of issues, and ethnic borders, again, I think that comes to something complicated that was already, there, right? The third point that I would like to comment on is the model, right? The modelization that you have tried to apply to this, to the case of the African continent. Now, I asked myself a rhetorical question, and that question was, what would happen if we applied this model to France or Germany, right? Would the result be different? Now, I would guess not, right? Let's see France, for instance. If you take Brittany and the rest of the rest of France, if you were to apply this model on the border of Brittany and the region next to it, or if you were to apply this in Germany between Bavaria and the rest of Germany, the result would probably be similar. You would find tensions between the different groups. Now, I think it's a fascinating model, but at the same time, I think we should be careful what the takeaway from it should be, right? Looking at, for instance, I was reading your paper yesterday. I looked at based on the map that you had produced, I looked at Murdoch's map, and I thought it was a frightening map, right? It is so fractured, such a fractured map. Now, that made me think, but this is really a map that does not present any hope of creating, how can there be unity when there is so much division, right? And then reflecting on how such knowledge, such ethnographic knowledge, was collected in the late 19th century and century, what was more or less this is the understanding of the Europeans. It's the Europeans who are trying to understand the African continent and trying to, seize it, so to speak, right? So that's what it is, the result of this, and I guess that's also what explains that at the same time, in the 19th and early 20th century, this is how Europeans understood it. But if you looked back in history, if you went back to the, what is known as the golden age of the African continent, right, from the 12th to the from the 1500s until the 1800s, you would find, although there are small entities like this, you also had bigger entities that were overarching and regrouping all of these tiny groups. I'm not saying that there wasn't conflict there, but at least, there was this overarching united kind of groups that were coming up and that were more or less inclusive and functional. So, and I think this is something that also got strengthened when you said that according to your observations, the conflicts did not apply to religious conflicts, that there was no impact, ethnicity had no impact on religious conflicts. So there could be something overarching. It could be religion, it could be politics, it could be trade, that brings together all of these different interests and make them functional. So, in my, the conclusion, my takeaway from these observations is that this model would work, would have more of a demonstration force if it were applied to just one simple, one single region, two specific ethnic groups, and if it were limited to that, and by putting also the other factors, right, it could be more, it could demonstrate, if you will, it would give it more force, in my opinion. And the reason I say this is because I guess that's how models function, right? They simplify, they complexify things first, and at the end of the day, it gives you a kind of a simpler, linear kind of explanation. Now, when it does that, what it leaves us with is this kind of, we end up believing or having the impression that Africa is this, although the ethnicities, although looking at Murdoch's map, we get this idea that Africa is hyper heterogeneous. The result of the model tends to make it homogeneous. It's as if the problems in that we find between ethnic group A and B in East Africa is similar and equal to what we would find thousands of kilometers later in the middle of or West Africa or South Africa. I think these are my comments. I mean, I can elaborate on the Q&A on the points if you want. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Tesfaye. So Professor Özak, would you like to respond to Fasil's question now?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Fasil. I mean, it's always, first, it's like a double super interesting point of view for me, because first it's a historian giving me feedback. So we have all these methodological differences, I think. But also the fact that you're actually an African historian who works on Africa, I think it makes it even more valuable. So really, really thank you for all your comments. I completely agree that there are like, for example, these big questions of what does an ethnicity really mean, right? That I completely agree. Here we're kind of, and that's where like, I'm just gonna wash my hands and say like, look, I'm taking as ethnicity what they tell me is an ethnicity, right? From my understanding, the way a lot of these groups are seen, a lot of has to do with kind of almost like linguistic groups, right? So it's like culturally homogeneous, linguistically homogeneous groups that existed at the moment of contact with colonialists, right? So in that sense, I mean, I agree that we can debate a lot of whether that really is an ethnicity or not, but that's going to be the definition that we're going to be working on, right? Now, I don't see, I agree with you, and that's part of like my in conformity perhaps with a lot of the conflict literature on Africa, is that everything ends up being just, everyone's different, so that's why they all fight all day, right? And so that's why I said, like, this paper in a sense came out of our previous paper. We were looking at intra-ethnic diversity, right? And we basically were focusing on kind of like the positive effects of this. But of course, we were forced also to look into the negative effects, right? And so we actually could not find any negative effects with whatever limited historical data we had, in the sense that more diverse societies were not kind of killing each other more or doing bad things among themselves. Nonetheless, we did find that they tended to fight more with other societies, right? Which is kind of where we started to think about the whole process of looking at ethnic borders, because it seemed that the fact that I am very diverse may actually allow me to prosper economically, create a state, and once you have a state, states just like to invade neighbors, right? So in that sense, for example, the examples that you were giving in the 15th century, 16th century, indeed, right? There were all these huge empires, right? We know in the area of Nigeria, right? In the end, some of the oldest universities are in the continent, right? So, so I don't think we are like dismissing that there exists this potential for good outcomes from diversity. Actually, I think part of the results that we're showing is that actually diversity is good. As long as you and I are very different, we don't seem to be fighting, right? So in a sense, if you think about that you and I like chocolate cake, and there's only one small piece of chocolate cake, you and I are gonna fight. But if you like chocolate cake and I like vanilla cake, then if there's only chocolate cake, I eat chocolate cake, you're okay with it, right? And so in that sense, I think that part of the evidence we're providing is going in that direction, that a lot of what's been thought about diversity per se being bad may not be the case, right? And so we're finding that indeed cultural similarity may be more problematic than cultural dissimilarity. And of course, this may be driven by a lot of other confounders that we have. Now, one part that when you were talking about the difficulty in the way about how Africans think about borders, I thought you were going in a different direction. Because I agree that in the end, like, national borders are determined by colonial powers, right? That's all the literature of the Scramble for Africa. That's all the literature of like how these ethnicities being split by colonialists is creating conflict. But the borders that we are studying are actually not those borders, right? So these are borders that somehow existed between these ethnicities even before perhaps that the Europeans came, right? And so I thought that your argument was going, because I've been reading a little bit about this, and so it seems like, in a sense, indeed, the way we think about borders is very European, right? Borders are for control of the land, and we like to really put sticks and things to ensure that this is my land, it's not yours. But that's not the way it was done, right? In Africa before, right? So if you look, for example, in how borders were delineated before between ethnicities, it's just mounds of dirt, or they would burn a piece of forest or something like this, right? So, which first creates precisely the problem of having very soft borders, because in the end, I can burn here, you burn there, and we can just end up fighting because you say, who's gonna say where it was, right? So in a sense, it is true that somehow it may be precisely because land was abundant, people were not, that there was no real incentive, and the way you interact with the land and with the idea of border does not exist directly, perhaps in the psyche or culture. And I thought that you were going in that direction. So in the other, I'm completely agree, right? The fact that, and I think that's a very large part of the literature arguing precisely that national borders crazily drawn somewhere in Europe by some people in a room without knowing anything about the continent still have a very big impact on conflict. But that's really not what we're trying to capture here, right? Then I think it's like, when you were talking about the model, I think it's mostly about the difference. This is where, like, I think economists and historians always, and I think anthropologists and archaeologists go in opposite directions, right? You guys like the very specific one case analysis. but that's precisely, I mean, there's actually a lot of anecdotal evidence and this kind of one case studies in the literature. Where we think we're giving a nice addition to this type of literature is that we're actually showing that this is a very general problem, right? And so when you think that what we're saying is that the conflict in one location and the conflict in another location 2,000 kilometers away may have a similar root, that's really what we think is really important in our work, because we're showing that somehow it is the competition for resources in a piece of land that's not well demarcated, which means that the property rights, and especially, I mean, we always think of property rights as kind of a private property, the individual kind of thing, right? Which again, may just be because we're so accustomed to thinking 20th century Western European idea of private property, right? But in Africa, we know that the land, for example, is the chief of the town who decides who gets the land, who can work it. You cannot sell it, right? You have to actually be working it, otherwise it gets assigned to someone else. And sometimes, so the fight between ethnicities, for example, we have a couple of those examples in the paper, is when ethnicity A and ethnicity B both say that they should be the ones deciding who's the boss of the town, right? And so there's more of a, that's why we call it like ethnic level private property, because it's kind of like ethnicity is having property over the structure, the local institutions and the decisions. And I think that's, again, I think that's a very common problem. And in a sense, we're trying to capture that this is a very global phenomenon within Africa, right? Then your next point was about, let me see. I wasn't sure when you said applying the model to other places, right? And so, and this again, I've always been very nervous with the literature that sees Africa as something strange and special, because I think like a lot of conflict may just be indeed nation building, right? And we look at Europe, Europe had a lot of nation building for a lot of centuries. So indeed, so it may just be something recent that we're observing, and that's the same case for other locations in the world. But I don't think that just because we see a lot of homelands in Murdoch that should make us despair. I think that perhaps actually the message of the paper actually, I think it's quite positive in terms of it shouldn't be too difficult to solve some of these issues, right? So if you look at the evidence with when you have this congruence between historical ethnic borders and administrative regions, and that you don't have as much conflict there, that suggests that somehow if you were able to bring ethnicities together, instead of, again, this may be, again, someone in the capital drawing administrative regions without taking into account reality and on the ground, right? So in that sense, if you're able to do that more correctly, if you're able then to allocate, again, the whole institutional structure, perhaps you would be able to solve this. And then you can have a huge country with many subdivisions, right? I mean, you look at the US, there are so many zip codes and counties and all kinds of things, but it's still one big country, right? So in that sense, I feel like perhaps our message is kind of positive, right? It's something that seems like you could be tackling institutionally, and we just need to be a little bit creative on how to deal with this.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Özak. Well, in the remaining 5 or more minutes, let's select some questions from the audience.
I think Fasil wanted to reply.
Okay, maybe we leave the remaining 5 minutes to the audience. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
We can talk after the audience.
Right. Yeah, actually, Professor Sasha Becker raised the first question when you present. He asks, "What's the meaning of the dependent variables?" But I guess
that was I showed it in the presentation, but then
okay.
I hope that's okay with Sasha. Otherwise,
yeah. So then the next question is from our colleague Professor Angela Leung. She asks, "Are there clear distinctions between tribes and ethnic groups, and whether their border coincide with each other?"
Yeah, I guess this goes kind of to the points that Fasil was raising, right? I mean, for me, a tribe and an ethnic group could be the same, right? Of course, you could think of tribes as subgroups within the bigger ethnic group, right? And so again, this is, if you think about what we do, the optimal thing would be to have a map at the tribe level or whatever the smallest thing is. And in the paper, we have some example of a conflict in Ovambo land in Namibia, right? And there, in a sense, it's a nice example because it's kind of an example of something similar happening, but not across ethnicities, but even within ethnicities, right? So these are two tribes within the same ethnic group, according to our data. And what we have there is some historical map that was drawn in the mid-19th century. And what happened about 10, 15 years ago is that, again, one of those, the chief of a location died, and then you have these two sub-tribes fighting over who has the right to impose the leader in that town. And the nice thing is that this is a town in the middle of nowhere. There's like no resources. This should have no major impact on politics or anything in the country. There was almost war between the biggest two ethnic groups in the country because of something that was happening in the middle of nowhere, right? And so again, this goes precisely that there may be these very weak ethnic property rights that may matter. And if we had the data, we could actually do it at the tribe level, right? But we really don't have it. So we focus only on the ethnic level.
Well,
may I say something about this? Because, you know, for me, as an Africa historian and an African, there is a problem with the use of the term tribe, because this is only a term that is used for subaltern nations, right? The term tribe is used for Africans. When it's used in Asia, it's to describe some, you know, some really lost kind of groups. Now, you know, and one of the advices that I give to my students is to never use the term tribe, because it is a term that doesn't apply elsewhere. We never talk about tribes when talking about diversity in Europe, right? So I think that's my major problem with this term. And as I was saying during my comments, ethnic groups comes from tribe. It is inherited. It's a kind of a continuation. You know, some of its negative thing was kind of peeled off, but it's basically the same idea that was transposed, civilized a little bit, cleaned a little bit, and you know, it's being sold as that. So I just wanted to say that, you know, these are problematic terminologies, and particularly tribe is a very problematic one.
Okay, good. So the next question is about the reverse causality. He asks, how did you deal with reverse causality between historical ethnic borders and conflicts, and whether historical ethnic border is the consequence of the more ancient and historical ethnic conflicts? And another question, I think it's more open and big. So what are the policy implications for these findings?
Okay, let me deal with the reverse causality. So again, notice that those ethnic borders that we have from Murdoch could be indeed just reflecting the fact that when colonialists arrive, they see a lot of fighting, and then they say, okay, ethnicity A and B, or these two groups are fighting, or people are fighting each other. So I'm gonna think that that's the border, right? So it could be that we have reverse causality in that sense. Now, clearly it cannot be in principle that this border from the past is being caused by conflict today, right? So in that sense, it cannot be reverse causality in the traditional way, if you want, of like conflict today causing this. But clearly it could be that it's more like an omitted variable where conflict in the past is causing conflict today, and it may be causing conflict, the cause of the location of the historical borders, according to Murdoch, right? And that's where we basically use our instrumental variable to overcome these type of problems, right? And plus, we show the evidence that historical conflict really is not affecting our results, right? So in that sense, that's how we tackle this problem of I think it's mostly about I think people are really thinking about historical conflict in this sense more than anything else. But I'm happy to elaborate if that's not the case. Policy implications, again, as I said, I mean, I think there's a lot of institutional things that can be changed, right? I think, and so one of the things we want to do at some point is really try to look at if we can identify, for example, some of the administrative level 1 or 2 within countries actually have the name of the people that live there, right? So if that's the case, it's more probable that this administrative region, they are still part of a larger nation, but they may have some more independence. They may have a better definition of what is their land, and so the location of those borders will not be as problematic, right? So in a sense, I think that would suggest that, and that's kind of like we find, but we didn't really do this extra step of trying to find all the borders that have the name of an ethnic group to try to see if those special borders have even less conflict, right? In a sense, where you can see this, of course, then in that case, you really have kind of like we're not in conflict because we kind of solved the problem beforehand, right? So it would be nice if we had this kind of evidence, but at least at the moment we don't have it.
Okay, so thank you so much, Professor Özak. I think time's up. We will forward all the other questions to Professor Özak for his consideration later. So sorry, we cannot cover all the questions now. So thank you. Today, we think we have learned a lot from both Professor Özak and Professor Tesfaye. In the end, let me announce our next events to be held next week. So next week, we will have a Mandarin webinar on a topic of archaeology. So we are much pleasure to have Professor Fu Qiaomei 教授 from Chinese Academy of Sciences to talk about the evolution of inheritance of the prehistoric people based on her research of DNA. So thank you for your support, and hope you can continuously support our webinar, and see you next week. So thank you again, Professor Özak. And
thank you so much for the invitation. It was very nice.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Bye.